Here are some questions to consider asking your subconscious. How can I double my close ratio? How can I make more sales with less effort? How can I set the company sales record? What can I do in the next 24 hours to create a quantum leap in my life? Or what can I do in the next 24 hours to create a quantum leap in my sales results? What would my ideal life look like? It's an interesting question. The first time that I ever thought about the question, what would my ideal life look like? I had a very difficult time answering the question because my ideal life was very different than how my life was at that time. And I had a very difficult time even imagining that it would be possible. And what I can tell you is that by continuing to ask myself the question, what would my ideal life look like? I began to get a clearer and clearer picture of what that ideal life would look like. And I'm very close to now living that life now. I have a beautiful home. I have a great company. I'm able to come in and do things like what I'm doing today, creating these wonderful audio programs to help impact people all over the world. And I'm able to go out every day and help people. What an amazing life I'm able to live. But that's not how it used to be. How I ended up creating what I now have is I began to ask myself questions like, what would my ideal life look like? And I began to create that. And I now have a wonderful son. And I shared with you earlier, my wife and I were having our 10-year wedding anniversary. And just so many amazing, amazing things. But it wasn't always that way. There was a time in my life when my wife and I separated. I went through a personal bankruptcy. I was waiting tables on a graveyard shift at Harrah's in Reno, Nevada, making $4.25 an hour. My car was repossessed. I've been on quota probation before, where if I didn't hit my quota at my sales company, my first job that I had, I'd be fired. So I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I began to think about what it is that I really want. How could I create that? How could I use goal setting and time management as a tool to create the life of my dreams? How can I leverage the resources that my company has to accomplish what it is that I want? I began to think, and then I took those thoughts and I implemented those thoughts and I took action. You see, some people think and they have no action. They can tell you everything about everything, but they haven't figured out how to go out and implement it. I'm going to now share a thought process with you that can help transform your sales results in your life. And it's the syntax for accessing power. And now I'm going to share a quick story with you. It's a story about Gandhi. And Gandhi years ago was in India, and the British were occupying India, and it wasn't working out too well. And everyone was saying, the thought process was, how can we better get along with the British? This is the thought process of the people of India. How can we improve our relations with the British? But see, that wasn't Gandhi's thought process. Gandhi looked at the situation from nothing. And he said, from nothing, if we could create India any way we wanted to create it, how would we create it? And the answer Gandhi got was a Britishless India. You see, no one else was getting that answer because they weren't asking the question. But see, Gandhi thought differently. If we could create India any way we wanted to create it, how would we create it? The answer was a Britishless India. So from nothing, Gandhi created a vision, which created a space. And then he went out to enroll others into the space. The space is what I'll call the bucket strategy. You see, if it's raining and there's no bucket out there, the rain falls into the ground and then, when the sun comes out, it dries up or it soaks into the grass. But if you have a bucket, the bucket can collect the rain. So when you declare a vision or you set a goal, it creates a bucket to capture the rain or capture the success. So Gandhi declares a vision from nothing of a Britishless India, which creates a space for people to join into the vision. The space was not created until Gandhi declared the vision. It may take you a few times to listen to this to really grasp what I'm saying. It's one of the most profound thoughts that I've ever come across. So Gandhi starts off and he goes to the British leaders. And if you've ever seen the movie Gandhi, right after the first intermission, he goes to British leaders and he tells them, I've been thinking it's time for all of you to leave. It's time for us to have our independence. So he goes to the British leaders and he attempts to enroll them in his vision. And they say no. And they laughed at him. He said, Gandhi, we have all the prime real estate. We're taxing you guys. We're not just going to get up and leave and give you your independence. Gandhi's like, okay, I just wanted to run it by you guys. I thought it was a pretty good idea. I wanted to see what you guys had to think about it. He said, well, we don't think it's a good idea. Don't think like that. So now Gandhi doesn't let the idea die. He goes out and he talks to the people of India and he enrolls them into the vision of a Britishless India. You see, once the bucket was created, there's now a space, kind of like the rain falling into the bucket. There's a space to organize the people of India. And so Gandhi enrolled 200 million people in his vision. Now, if you were in network marketing, or even if you weren't, imagine that you're in network marketing. Would you like to have Gandhi on your front line? Greatest networker in history. In Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill said Gandhi was the most powerful human being in the history of the world because of his ability to organize people's thoughts. Gandhi enrolled 200 million people in his vision. It's hard enough to get two people to agree with you, let alone 200 million. And so Gandhi goes back to the British leaders and he says, I've gotten together with the people of India and we now want you to leave. There were no guns fired and the British left. Gandhi became one of the most powerful human beings in the history of the world. He created a vision from nothing, which created a space, and then he enrolled others into that space and into that vision or into that bucket. And I'll share a couple more examples of this, of other people in history who have done this very thing. And the next one is about Mary Kay. And Mary Kay started Mary Kay Cosmetics after she retired from her direct sales career. She was writing down notes in her journal about what her ideal company would look like. And she wrote down ideas about Mary Kay. She literally created Mary Kay from scratch on paper, imagining from nothing her ideal company. So again, from nothing, you create a vision. Mary Kay created a vision of her ideal company. She declared the vision. Once she declared the vision, it created a space for people to join her. Accountants and salespeople and receptionists and office space. And it attracted all of these things to her. And then her job was to then go out and enroll others into the vision. Share with them about the most powerful company that she could think of, which she created from scratch. Mary Kay is now a multi-billion-dollar company internationally. It's interesting that a woman who was retired and wasn't driven to go out and start this company initially, just put the ideas down on paper, created one of the most powerful companies in the world. Another example of this, it's one of my favorite stories. It's about Craig Kielburger, and he wrote a book called Free the Children. Interestingly enough, there are places in the world today where child slavery still exists. And Craig's from Canada, and he was reading an article at age, I believe, 12, about a child who had been in slavery and then was released from slavery, and he became an advocate to eliminate child slavery worldwide. And some of the business people who employ child slaves had this young boy killed. And Craig's reading this article. This other child was about Craig's age. He couldn't believe it. Places in the world today where child slavery exists. Now, most people looking at that, Craig lives in Canada. This is happening in another part of the world. I'm only 12 years old. What can I do? I couldn't do anything. What Craig did, though, is he looked at it from nothing, and he created a vision of Free the Children, eliminating child slavery globally, just like a little vision, right? And so he creates this vision, which created a space, and then he goes out and enrolls other people in the vision. So Craig enrolled a few people that you might have heard of in his vision. The Pope. He enrolled former Vice President Al Gore. He was from Canada. He enrolled the Prime Minister of Canada, which is equivalent to the President of the United States. I was enrolled, the Dalai Lama, and many, many other people. Mark Victor Hansen has spoke about Craig Kyleberger. Cynthia Kersey has spoken about Craig Kyleberger. Many, many other powerful people. And Craig wrote a book called Free the Children, and that's how I learned about Craig Kyleberger. And on the book jacket, it says, The Journey of the Most Powerful Kid in the World. So the question is, how did Craig Kyleberger access power? From nothing, he created a vision, which created a space, and he then enrolled others into the vision. When I started my company by myself out of a spare bedroom in my condo 4 years ago, from nothing, I created a vision of my company, Eric Lofholm International, to be the company that would have a bigger impact on the profession of selling than any previous company in the history of the world, which created a space, and then I began to enroll others in the space. I enrolled people to come work for me. I enrolled an accountant. I got office space. I've enrolled thousands and thousands of people to attend my public seminars. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been involved in working for me with my organization to help me succeed. How did I access the power? I declared a vision from nothing, which created a space, and then I enrolled others in the space. What if I didn't understand that thought process? What if I had never heard of that thought process? Sales is a thinking man's game. Sales is a thinking woman's game. Think about that process. How can you apply that to your life? I want you to consider looking at the way that you generate referrals from nothing. I'd like you to look at your sales presentation from nothing. Look at your paperwork flow from nothing. Think. Use your mind and become a sales superstar. Look at your goal setting from nothing. How do you train people? Look at it from nothing. How do you recruit people? How do you go about the way of generating the sales that you currently generate? Are you just doing the same old? Or are you thinking? Are you thinking like the woman from Norm Reeves Honda who placed the ad on the Asian radio network and in the Asian newspaper and went to number one at the number one dealership in the world for Honda? Think. I'd like to give you another thought process now. It's called the ripple effect. I want you to imagine a lake, and it's a smooth lake. And now this helicopter comes out in the middle of the lake, and it drops this giant boulder right in the center of the lake. The boulder would create a ripple, and then the ripple would create a ring, and 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 a ring, all the way out to the shore. Everything affects everything. So I want you to think about former President Clinton. Former President Clinton had a little situation that happened that created a ripple. And do you remember what that was? A lot of people think that it was Monica Lewinsky, but that actually was a ring. And then other people say, well, no, it was Paula Jones that created the ripple. And no, again, that was another ring. What actually created the ripple was something that happened probably in former President Clinton's life when he was very, very young. And there was a point very early on in his life where he made a decision that it was okay to cheat. And that one decision created a ripple. And then it created a ring, and a ring, and a ring, and a ring. And that one decision that he made as a very young child impacted his life for the rest of his life. Everything affects everything. There's a couple of great movies that have ripples in them. One is Back to the Future, and the other one is Time Cop with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And they can travel back in time, and you can see how actions were changed previously in history. And in the movie, you can see how by changing those actions, it ended up changing the present, which ultimately changed the future. Now, you can't go back in time, but what I want to suggest to you is the actions that you're taking now are creating ripples. I want you to know that. By you listening to this audio program, you are creating a powerful ripple. And if you'll take me up and play at a level 10 and listen to this program 7 times, you will put all of these key ideas and concepts into your subconscious, and you'll benefit from them every single day for the rest of your career. And you'll make tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. Because by listening to this program, it creates a ripple, which creates a ring. And it creates another ring. And it creates another ring. That's the ripple effect. The next thought process that I want to give you, it's called the tipping point. And this is a thought process that has helped many, many people, including myself, become sales superstars. And I want you to imagine a teeter-totter. And picture in your mind a teeter-totter, and one edge of the teeter-totter is all the way on the ground, and then that would make the other end sticking straight up. Now, the one sticking straight up in the air, I want you to put a little bit of weight on it, just a little bit. And then a little weight would cause the bottom of the teeter-totter to go up a little bit. So one's going down with the weight and the other one's going up. And then you put a little bit more weight. And then the bottom one goes up a little bit more, and then the top one goes down a little bit. And then you add a little bit more weight. It continues to move. You add a little bit more weight, a little bit more weight. And now all of a sudden, the teeter-totter is exactly even. You put a little bit more weight on the side that you've been putting all the weight on, and all of a sudden, the teeter-totter tips, and the one drops all the way to the ground. The other side goes all the way up to the top. Well, this is what can happen in your sales career. You see, when you're building your sales business, initially, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of work, and then you get to the point where eventually, boom, your business tips. And for the last 4 years, I've had focus, I've had discipline, I've gone to work every single day knowing that one day my business would tip. Every time I made a presentation, every time I got a new customer, every time I created a new product, every time I created a new seminar, my business would get closer and closer to tipping. This audio program will allow me to reach people all over the world, and it'll be one step closer to tipping. Now, my business has not tipped yet, but it will. That's one of the reasons why I'm so focused and so disciplined. And I take as much action as I take because I understand the tipping point. And I want to share with you 2 powerful examples of people who also understood the tipping point. And these are superstars, and their businesses have already tipped. And the first one, I mentioned her earlier, is Marty Rodriguez. And Marty is an amazing woman. I want to share with you a quick story before I talk about the tipping point. My wife years ago became a real estate agent, and she asked me if I knew any other realtors that I could introduce her to that could help her to be successful in her career. And at that time, I did not have my own sales training company. I was an employee with Tony Robbins, and Marty Rodriguez endorses Tony on Tony's infomercial. And I said, well, the number one realtor in the world is this woman, Marty Rodriguez. And I happen to know Brett Figueroa, who worked for Tony Robbins also, and Brett was friends with Marty. So I introduced my wife to Brett, and I asked, Brett, if he could introduce my wife to Marty, and he did that. So my wife calls up Marty, and Marty's never met my wife. My wife's in her early 20s, and my wife calls up and says, I'm Jairus Lofholm, and you don't know me. I'm a friend of Brett Figueroa's, and I want to know if I could learn from you as a realtor. And Marty says, well, why don't you come up and why don't you spend the day with me and go around with me on my sales calls and watch what I do? I want you to think about that for a second. You have the number one producer in all of Century 21. And at that time, I wasn't a sales trainer. My wife was in her early 20s. And Marty allowed my wife to go with her for a full day. What an incredible person that is. Well, I was listening to some audio tapes about Marty's career. It was a seminar that she was giving, and they audio taped it. And Marty was talking about when she first got started as a realtor. She went and she would knock on every door in her community. So every single person in her community would know who she was. Now think about this. Could every realtor in America knock on every door in their community, at least the area that they wanted to market to? They could. How many of them actually do it? Very few. But see, Marty, she either knew the concept or she believed that something powerful would happen in her business, the concept of the tipping point. At some point, she would create enough momentum in her business and her business would tip. Marty is up in Glendora, California, and she is the dominant realtor in that marketplace. Her business tipped. Another story of somebody whose business tipped is about Robert Schuller, who's with the Hour of Power. It's the most widely watched religious program on television today. Robert Schuller moved to Garden Grove, California, and he started up his church. And when he first got started, it was just himself and his wife and I believe one other friend that belonged to the church, 3 people. He needed members. He went and knocked on doors. Robert Schuller knocked on 3,500 doors that very first year. And he would ask people a series of questions. Do you currently belong to a church? If they said no, if you were to join, what services would you be interested in that church providing? And then he would extend an invitation. I'd like to invite you to our service coming up on Sunday. And he built the church, and then the church eventually tipped. And again, it's the most widely watched religious service on television today. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, I don't know. I mean, Marty went to #1 as a realtor. She just got lucky. There's just a lot of people in Glendora that happen to want to buy and sell real estate. Or you might be thinking, Robert Schuller, he got lucky. There's just a lot of people seeking spiritual guidance in Garden Grove. Obviously, that's not the case. They went out and they built their businesses belly to belly, one-to-one. And you could do the same thing over the telephone. That's what I've done over the last 4 years. Each of the last 4 years, I've driven over 40,000 miles, going belly to belly and meeting people face to face and extending invitations to come to my public seminars. And the businesses continue to grow and grow and grow. And I will not stop. I will continue to go out belly to belly and meet people and connect with them one-on-one until my business does tip. And once the business does tip, then it's just a matter of maintaining it. One of the simplest personal development strategies, yet one of the most profound at the same time, is the concept of modeling. Now, obviously, we're not talking about fashion modeling, okay? We're talking about modeling in the sense of duplicating excellence. Excellence and achievement has a structure, and that structure is duplicatable. Now, that sentence is extremely important, so I'm going to say that again. Excellence and achievement has a structure, and that structure is duplicatable. The modeling principle is if someone else is producing a result, if you do what they do, then you'll produce a similar result. Gandhi said what's possible for one is possible for all. Now, I have to be honest with all of you. Before I ever learned modeling, I myself was extremely successful. In fact, my very first job I ever had right out of high school, I made over $100,000 right out of high school. Now, when I share that with people, sometimes people say, well, Eric, that's pretty good and all, but was what you were doing, was it legal? How did you make over $100,000? I mean, that's incredible. Or sometimes people say, well, Eric, what was it that you were doing? Well, I'll be honest with you. I did not make over $100,000. That would have been a great story. Kid right out of high school makes over $100,000. No, what I made over $100,000 of, I made over 100,000 hamburgers. I was literally a cook at McDonald's. My second job, I did so well, I was literally rolling in dough. Yeah, you might have guessed it, I was a dough roller at Round Table Pizza. That actually was my job title. At Round Table, they call them pizza skins, and they roll the pizza skins fresh every day, and there's somebody who has that responsibility of coming in before the shift starts and rolling the pizza skins for the day, and that was my job title. I went to community college, which typically you're supposed to go to for 2 years. I shared it with you earlier. I went to community college for 5 years and never got my AA degree. So I was not exactly what you would call an overachiever back then. I was anything but an overachiever. And then I was introduced to the modeling concept. The very first time I was introduced to modeling was in seeing one of Anthony Robbins' infomercials. And it was a really interesting experience. It was the very first time I'd ever seen Tony's infomercial. And when I worked at Round Table and at McDonald's, oftentimes I would also work the closing shift. Being a college student, you pick up hours at night. And one time I got home about 1 o'clock in the morning from a closing shift. And what's on television late at night at about 1 o'clock? Yeah, you probably guessed it, infomercials. And it was the first time I ever saw one of Tony's infomercials. And Tony was being interviewed by Fran Tarkington. And at that point, I was depressed. My life was going nowhere. When I worked at McDonald's, I made $27,000 when I worked at McDonald's, which is not a lot when you consider it took me 3 years to make the $27,000. Okay, I used to make about $9,000 a year I had never earned over $10,000 in a year before. And so I was broke. My life's not working. I was down, and, there's Anthony Robbins. And what's interesting, if you've ever seen me in person, you know that I resemble Tony. A lot of people think I might be a cousin or something like that. I resemble Tony. And when I was watching the infomercial, it was like I was watching myself on television. And the way that Tony was thinking, the thought process that he was describing, I had never thought like that ever before. And when he talked about modeling, if someone else was producing a result, that if you did what they did, you could produce a similar result, I was very skeptical. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. How could you possibly do that? I mean, if that were true, if somebody else was making $10,000 a month, that if I did what they did, I could make $10,000 a month. And as I shared with you, I had never made $10,000 in a year. Within 18 months of learning the modeling principle, I had my first month of personal income and a sales opportunity in excess of $10,000. Modeling suggests if you make $3,000 a month, if somebody in your industry makes 10, if you do what they do, you can make 10. If somebody does 100 real estate transactions a year, if you do what they do, you could do 100 real estate transactions a year. If somebody owns 10 rental properties, if you find out how they're doing it, if you do what they do, you could have 10 rental properties. Very profound concept, very much in expanding your belief system and what's possible. Because modeling suggests basically any result that's ever been accomplished, if you do what they do, you could produce a similar result. When you model somebody, two things you model: belief and strategy. Belief and strategy, that's the structure of excellence. So I ended up in professional selling. It's an interesting story on how I ended up in sales, and I want to share that with you now as a source of inspiration. I think stories are, many of them, so inspirational. They really cause people to take more action in their life. And to pick up the story from the beginning, when I was telling you, I went and saw Dante Perano speak, and he was talking about that book, How to Be Rich by J. Paul Getty, if you remember that story from the beginning. And Dante made a statement in the seminar, and that one sentence changed my life forever. I really believe in seminars, not just because I teach them. I mean, obviously I'm biased regarding that, but my life changed because of seminars. And in the seminar, Dante said, if you're willing to do the work, I'll teach you what to do. I think what he meant was, if you buy my books and tapes, they'll teach you what to do. What I heard was, if I go work for Dante, he'll show me step by step how to become a successful real estate investor. And so I made a decision to go work for him. And I moved from Sacramento, California to Reno, Nevada. And I was working for Dante. And at that time, my wife and I, we were engaged. We had not yet set a date for our wedding, but we were engaged. I shared that story with you earlier. And I moved to Reno. And I thought I was going to learn how to become a real estate investor with Dante. And what I learned was how to become a sales superstar. When I got there, I literally would have done any job for Dante. I would have swept the floors. I would have answered phones. I would have worked the mailroom. I just wanted to be around this man and learn real estate investing. I wanted to model his real estate investment strategies. So when I got there, they said, we have an entry-level telemarketing position. Pays $5.25 an hour. We have some people making as much as $10,000 a month in the position, but the base pays $5.25 an hour. Now, I had been used to making about that at McDonald's and Round Table, so I was satisfied with the $5.25 an hour. And I'd been working there for 2 weeks, had not yet made a sale. They didn't give me any training. They just said, here's some leads, make some calls. And the manager called me in the office after 2 weeks, and he said, Eric, how are you doing? I said, I'm doing pretty good. He's all, well, how many sales have you made so far? And he knew the answer was 0. He said, well, I haven't made any. He says, yeah, can you explain that? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I can. He says, well, how can you explain that? Here's my explanation. Nobody wanted to buy. I was calling up doing customer service calls. I wasn't delivering sales presentations because I, at that time, didn't even know what a sales presentation was. I didn't have the distinction between a customer service call and a sales presentation. And at that time, I was introduced to a quota. And so I began to have pressure on myself to produce better results. And about this time, my fiance, who's now my wife, came to visit me. And I was all by myself in Reno, and I was really missing her. And so I said, well, why don't you move to Reno, Nevada? My wife's name is Jairus. And Jairus said, Eric, I was raised by my grandparents. I'm a little old-fashioned, and I can't live with you until we're married. So when we get married, then we can live together. And I said, well, we're already engaged. Now, keep in mind, we didn't have a date yet for the wedding. We're already engaged, so why don't we just get married now? And so she was 18 at the time, and I was 22, and we're young and dumb. And so we made a decision that we were going to elope. And so 4 days later, we eloped. We have the most unusual anniversary date. It's December 19th. Not a whole lot of people in the world get married on December 19th because it's so close to the holidays. Interestingly enough, at my Advanced Sales Mastery Boot Camp that I taught with Dr. Moyne recently, there was a couple, I kid you not, listen to this, they also were married on December 19th. And they also are celebrating their 10-year wedding anniversary. They were married the same day we were 10 years ago. Very unusual date to pick to have your anniversary on. And so we got married. My wife moved up to Reno, and now I'm working for Dante. And very shortly thereafter, I became Dante's assistant. And what that meant was I traveled around the country, and I would literally carry his bags and book his hotels for him and handle his product sales at the seminar. And I traveled around the country, and I was personally mentored by one of the most powerful speakers, I believe, in the history of the world. I would go out on these speaking engagements around the country. I would come back from 4 or 5 days on the road and tell my wife I just aged another year. And I was being mentored by one of the most incredible speakers in the world. And because of that mentoring, my selling skills began to improve. Not by much, but a little bit. And I completed my first year with Dante. And I was the bottom producer at that company. There was about 15 salespeople that did telephone sales, and I was the worst of all 15. It's so ironic now that I'm a sales trainer and emerging as one of the premier sales trainers in the world, yet I was horrible at selling. Definitely not a born salesperson. And at the end of that first year, I missed my quota for 2 months in a row. And at the company, they had a 3 strikes and you're out rule. And Dante's wife, Sandy, was the one who ran the operations, and she informed my sales manager, Richard Hogan, Richard, you tell Eric if he doesn't hit his quota next month, he is out. I mean, he's a nice kid and all, but if he can't hit his quota, we don't have a place for him. So Richard calls me in the office, and he writes down, as per my conversation with Sandy, if you miss your quota next month of $10,000, you'll be let go. And there was 2 others that were put on quota probation with me. That next month, the quota was $10,000 in gross sales. I did $10,500 in gross sales. Woohoo! I got to keep my job. I did it by an extra $500, and I was able to keep my job. One of the other 2 individuals who was on quota probation unfortunately missed his quota. At that time, he was 18, and I was 23 years old, and he was let go, and I was able to keep my job. Interestingly enough, he did $9,500 in sales. He missed his by 500. I made mine by 500. And ladies and gentlemen, at that point, my life transformed. Because the next month, I did $51,000 in sales. I went from the bottom producer to the top producer within 30 days. That was February of that year. In September of that year, I did $160,000 in gross sales, 16 times quota. You say, Eric, how are you able to do that? I was introduced to Dr. Donald Moyne, who I believe is the top sales mind in the world today. And Dr. Moyne began to teach me his advanced selling techniques. And I then shortly thereafter hired him to coach me. And I asked Dr. Moyne recently if he would teach a seminar with me and teach the most powerful advanced sales training techniques that exist in the world today. And he agreed to do that. So he and I just recently have begun to teach boot camps together. If you ever have an opportunity to come and spend 2.5 days with us, you're in for one of the most powerful sales training experiences that you could ever find. When you start producing outstanding results at your company, people will begin to wonder, how are you able to do it? And they'll begin to pick your brain, and they'll begin to model you. And so I had that happen. And the first individual who began to model me is a man named David Fryer. And David had just moved to Reno, Nevada from Minnesota. And David was a music instructor. He taught music to high school kids. And he moved out, and he was attracted to Dante, as I was. He went to one of Dante's seminars, and he, like me, I need to be around this man. And so he picked up, and he moved to Reno, Nevada. And his wife, Marty, and their young son stayed in Minnesota. And Marty and the young son said, Dad, go out to Reno, start making some money, get it set up for us, and then we will move out to Reno and follow you. And so David came out, and he had no sales background, like I had no sales background, and David, like me, was very poor at selling. And he began to pick my brain, and I began to share with David what I was doing in selling. One of my gifts, whether it's sales training or algebra or whatever the case may be, is to explain ideas and concepts to other people in a way that they can understand them. And so David began to ask me how was I able to produce the sales results, and I was able to communicate it to him in a way that he could understand it. And his results went up. And then they went up, and then they went up. Within a very short period of time of me mentoring, coaching, and training David Fryer, he went from about $5,000 in gross sales to over $20,000 in gross sales during a 2-week pay period. His sales literally skyrocketed. And as David's results increased, more and more people began to ask me, Eric, how are you able to do it? I never set a goal to become a sales trainer. I literally fell into becoming a sales trainer. The more ideas I shared with people, the more success they had in their sales career. Who is the top producer in your office? Who produces outstanding sales results that you could model? One of the most powerful tips I've ever learned on how to close more sales is to go on live sales calls with master salespeople, with sales superstars. Interestingly enough, many people never approach sales superstars and say, hey, can I go on one of your live sales calls? Out of fear of rejection. But what I found is every time I've ever asked a sales superstar, could I either listen to your phone calls or ride along with you on one of your live sales calls, I've never once been turned down. In fact, when I went and worked for Anthony Robbins, the #1 producer for 2 straight years there, an amazing sales talent, a man named Chuck Douglas. Chuck has his own sales training company now. If you ever have the opportunity to experience one of Chuck's trainings, you're in for a real treat. And Chuck was the top producer for 2 consecutive years, never once lost a cycle. And I asked Chuck, is it okay if I ride along with you? Can I go on one of your sales calls? And Chuck said, absolutely. And I did this 3 or 4 times. And after I'd done that, the 3rd or 4th time I asked Chuck, do any of the other people ever go on the sales calls with you? And he says, Eric, interestingly enough, you're the first person that's asked to go on one of my calls in a long time. Powerful, powerful strategy. When you model somebody, you model belief and strategy. I want to share a couple of strategies with you to teach you how to raise your belief in yourself, ways of thinking. And the first example is a story. It's a powerful story about a football game between East Carolina and North Carolina State. And I shared this story in the beginning of our audio program. I told you that I went and did a motivational talk for my brother's Little League baseball team, and I gave all of them journals, and I shared the story that I'm going to share with all of you right now. And after I'm done, I'll share with you the impact that it had on my brother's Little League baseball team. East Carolina had not been to a bowl game in years. They had been a horrible football team. Jeff Blake, who now plays for the Baltimore Ravens, was the quarterback at East Carolina. And if you make it to the NFL as a quarterback, typically you're a superstar in college. And Jeff Blake was that in college. And he led his team to a bowl game when they were playing NC State. And in that game, they were getting crushed. In fact, they were losing by 17 points with 7 minutes to go. Now, in a football game, if you've been dominated the entire game and you're losing by 17 points with 7 minutes to go, what's typically the end result of that game? That's right. Typically, you're going to lose that game. And there was one fan in the East Carolina section. There's about 20,000 fans in total sitting in the East Carolina section. One fan began to chant, "We believe. We believe. We believe." And he began to chant, "We believe." And before you know it, there's about 8 people that joined in with the chant. "We believe. We believe. We believe." And then, have you ever been to a sporting event and maybe like you see somebody that starts doing the wave and it catches on and everybody in the entire stadium, they begin to do the wave? Well, this is what happened with the 20,000 fans in the East Carolina section. They all began to chant, "We believe, we believe, we believe." And the game ended. East Carolina came back to score 3 unanswered touchdowns, and they won that game. Never underestimate the power of belief. Never underestimate the power of belief. And I shared that story with my brother's Little League baseball team. And it was before the season started. And they had a lot of 12-year-olds on that team that year and a few 13-year-olds that were mostly a younger team. And they weren't predicted to be one of the top teams. And they were mentally prepared for that season. And I didn't tell them to do this. They did it on their own. When they were in a game and they were losing in the 4th, 5th, or 6th inning, they would chant in the dugout. When they were batting, they'd chant, "We believe, we believe, we believe." And they were playing a team that year that had not lost a baseball game in a year and a half. Now, most Little Leaguers, if you're playing the team that hasn't lost in a year and a half, what would you normally believe is going to be the end result of that game? You probably believe you're going to lose because they haven't lost in a year and a half. But they believed. They became the first team to beat that team that hadn't lost in a year and a half. They had 4 or 5 come from behind victories in the last few innings. They won the league and they won the playoffs. Never underestimate the power of belief. Now here's what's powerful. I never told them when I gave the motivational talk, okay, here's what I want you to do. If you're down in the 4th, 5th, or 6th inning, I want you guys to chant in the dugout. I didn't tell them that. You see, they thought. They used their mental intellect. Selling is a thinking man's game. Selling is a thinking woman's game. They took the concept, they applied mental thought, and they won the league.